Many Americans do not realize the effect that images portrayed in film have on our minds. Most portrayals of minority characters in film are not analyzed or looked at objectively, and this can be quite dangerous. It is through these images that stereotypes are reinforced and racism is justified. African Americans have a rich history in America. They have fought past slavery, endured intense and brutal racism, civil rights movements, and are still striving for equality today. Although the history is extremely important, historical interpretations of African Americans as perceived by white producers have not given a fair representation at all. Even as we watch some of the more sympathetic films of the past and present, accurate depictions are difficult to find. The best way to see African American life as it really is through the eyes of a black producer or director. When they tell their own stories, they represent the people as they truly are rather than the inhuman stock characters or stereotyped characters that we have seen in the past. In most of the first films, including black characters, there were many political undertones related to the abolition of slavery in America. Different types of archetypal characters represented different views of African Americans that reinforced the idea that slavery was beneficial, and without it everything was out of control. Valerie Smith, a professor of English at UCLA, describes the portrayals of these characters. Quote, "The early silent period of motion pictures remains important, not because there were any great black performances, there weren't, but because of the 5 basic types, the boxes sitting on the shelf, that were to dominate the black characters for the next half-century." End quote. Although the point that there were not any great black performances is arguable, Smith is correct in the fact that the stock characters do take over the screens across America. These portrayals of African Americans by white directors perpetuated many stereotypes and devastatingly negative generalizations for this group of oppressed people. Each of the 5 main types of archetypal black characters was linked to a specific idea that white men in power wanted to promote. These characters were made popular first in minstrel shows and then moved to become regulars on the big screen. For instance, the coon was a black character that attempted to become like a white person, but ended up humiliating himself in his own stupidity. The mammy is the main woman archetypal character. This brutish mother is a strict controller of her own household, but is entirely submissive and caring for her own master. The old man, or the uncle character, is often called the Tom, for Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin. He reminisces about the good old days of slavery where everything was in control and peaceful. Contentment in slavery was portrayed through the character by the name of Sambo. His childlike actions and happy song and dance showed that slaves were happy in their submissive positions. The last of the main 5 characters was the brutal black buck. This man was strong and mean, preying on white women. He represented what whites thought that African American men would be like without the constraints of slavery. The Birth of a Nation was one of the most effective yet harmful films showing the possible and exaggerated effects of life with freed African American slaves. This film was produced by a man named D.W. Griffith. Griffith used images to create very powerful anti-black and anti-abolitionist propaganda, and many people believed that what they saw on the screen was an actual possibility in the South. The film was released in 1915 and was the first to be shown in the White House under President Woodrow Wilson. This gave the film a sense of authority and authenticity that persuaded many people to perceive this film as truthful. The effects that it had on the public were devastating and violent. In the film, the Ku Klux Klan was idolized for saving the white Southerners from rebel black armies, and in real life, at the time, this caused many riots, African Americans being lynched, and many upset whites and African Americans. This film prominently used the archetypal character of the brutal black buck, and again reinforced the idea that America without the structure of slavery would be overrun by uncivilized black rebels. It showed the emancipation as a huge mistake. Many people again bought into this idea, and the notion that black people were not equal to white people was carried on. Even more harmful than an argument for inequality, this suggested that African Americans should be thrust back into the slavery that so many people fought and died to abolish. Film images of African Americans started to change as black producers and filmmakers became more prominent and civil rights movements began. In the 1970s, a new genre of film by the name of blaxploitation emerged in urban black audiences. The main goal of this type of film was black empowerment. Although the producers of these types of films were trying to build up African Americans, they often played into the white man's stereotypes about African Americans and the urban poor. Spike Lee is an African American producer and director that has successfully made changes to black film that better represent black culture. He began filmmaking and producing in 1983, shortly after the influence of blaxploitation. His first films were created independently of any large commercial companies, which gave him the freedom to tell his stories as he wanted. Produced on a small budget and edited in his apartment, She's Gotta Have It from 1986 was Lee's first feature film and was widely popular in the realm of independent film. Nola, the main female lead character, represented what it was like to be a woman in her community and struggles that she faced. Later, Lee would go on to attract more diverse audiences, but at that point in his career, having a big audience of any kind, even though they were not very diverse, was a huge accomplishment. While audiences tended to react happily to the films, oftentimes people called for censoring of some of the more negative portrayals of African Americans. Lee would refuse these requests because he wanted to focus on all aspects of African American life, both good and bad. He knew that he could represent these communities fairly, even including a couple negative aspects. He showed many struggles that the black community faced in their daily life in a way that audiences were surely able to relate. Although Spike Lee does not paint an entirely accurate picture of black life in the United States, he does show the great strides that black film has taken over the years. The progress that has been made in nearly 100 years after the birth of a nation is unbelievable. Lee has opened the door for many more African American producers and directors to become successful in commercial America. This is very important for the authentic image of African American life to be perpetuated and keep debunking stereotypes that previous filmmakers have created. Although the old images still have an effect on the perceptions of black people today, they have diminished greatly, and insight of real black culture is more accessible than it has ever been before. While progress has been made, there is still a long way to go in bringing these newer images into popular culture and changing the mindsets of people that have long been exposed to unrealistic portrayals of these people. It is a slow transformation, but if filmmakers make as much progress in the next 100 years as they've made in the last 100, we are headed in a much better direction. African Americans being able to tell their own stories is something that every person in America can benefit from.